On May the 2nd, the country was stunned by news that the submarine HMS Conqueror had torpedoed a large Argentinian warship, the General Belgrano. 2 days after the Belgrano was sunk, the Argentinians struck back, hitting HMS Sheffield, one of Britain's most modern destroyers.
That was a big shocker. HMS Sheffield was our latest warship, and the Argentinians had taken her out. And here were we on a huge ship packed with Marines. That was a little bit worrying.
The Royal Navy was more vulnerable than the tough talk at home had suggested. The Sheffield had spotted the incoming Exocet missile far too late.
The Sheffield was lost through negligence. The captain of the Sheffield had not switched his mind to war. Otherwise he would have had all his electronics on. He'd have told the crew that they could not send messages home to their loved ones, and he would not have had the galleys frying up
But what's
chips.
been forgotten is how close we came to defeat.
If you rerun the Falklands War with the mistakes on both sides eliminated, the Argentines win. Hands down, every time you run the tape.
This is the story of how we nearly lost the Falklands War.
It was a shock to see one's own ship explode, burn and sink before one's eyes.
It will uncover the mistakes that stacked the odds against young British servicemen.
So they hadn't seen how deadly those guys could be. I can tell you, if I'd been on board that ship, I'd have swum ashore rather than stayed there.
And reveal just what it took to overcome those odds.
The snipers were really good. These guys will not run away. And we realised that we were in for a fight.
The British now faced the single greatest gamble of the war. More than 5,000 troops in 3 commando brigade had to be landed on the islands.
This was the one thing that I worried about more than any other thing the whole time.
To minimize the risk, the British led the Argentinians to believe the attack on Stanley would come from the south. But in fact, the plan was to launch the assault 60 miles to the north, from a lightly defended bay called San Carlos. But even here, the British would still be vulnerable to air attack.
Carrying out amphibious operations without air superiority are a bad idea.
The British planned to go ashore under the cover of darkness to minimize the threat. But in the wild winter seas, the risky nature of the plan became clear. Landings were badly delayed. The troops had lost the crucial cover of darkness. The troops reached shore safely, but 3 hours later, the Argentinian air attacks began. They targeted the ships, the lifeline for the task force.
How the British task force commanders have underestimated the determination of the Argentine pilots.
Ship after ship in San Carlos water was hit by Argentinian aircraft. The British christened the bay Bomb Alley.
This was the first time I'd seen ships sunk by enemy action in my life.
I was watching Antelope, and suddenly a huge explosion in front of my eyes. Large parts of her superstructure flew up into the air.
I remember that explosion echoing round, and then followed by a series of other explosions that went all night.
The crew was rescued, but the ship was doomed.
The following morning, she folded like a deck chair, her back broken, and sank, and both her nose and her stern could be seen above the water for some time. And eventually, the nose disappeared, and all that was left was a small life raft, as if to anchor, as if to mark the spot where the ship had gone down.
The Argentinian air attacks were relentless. British ships and Harrier aircraft shot down more than 60 enemy planes. But many Argentinian pilots were getting through to hit their targets. The commander of the fleet recorded his frustrations in forceful language.
At about 1900, yet another bloody disaster. 3 A4s bombed Coventry and Broadsword. Coventry badly hit and sinking.
HMS Coventry, a destroyer, was hit and has been lost.
Admiral Woodward was sharply critical of some of the British ship's defences.
No missiles fired, which is quite extraordinary and saps any faith we may have in our modern systems.
For God's sake, they sent ships down there with anti-aircraft capability they knew didn't work. What we had was a thing called Seacat, which was first-generation guided missile, really no use at all, unknown to be no use.
On the same day that the Antelope sank, 2 other British ships, the Galahad and the Lancelot, were struck by massive bombs. Incredibly, they didn't detonate. Naval mine disposal expert Bernie Bruin had the perilous job of finding out why they hadn't exploded, and then disposing of them.
When we got on board Galahad, the first thing we had to do was to find out where the bomb was. And the only way you can do this is to find where it enters and follow the trail of destruction. It had hidden itself in amongst the debris, wrapped in a big sheet of aluminium which it had collected on the way. The one thing we could see, of course, was the nose and this yellow stripe, so we knew it was a British 1,000-pound bomb.
Argentina had acquired these bombs before the war. Now they were being used against British ships. Naval commanders had a theory about why the bombs were not detonating.
We had to find out whether this fuse had been armed because the prognosis was that they'd been dropping these bombs too low and that they weren't being armed. And normally these fuses are activated by a propeller in the tail turning this little device here, which unscrews a screw which allows the fuse to arm itself and to move and work. Normally they fall out completely, but if they're still left in, you have to find out by counting the number of screw threads just how far it has gone into the arming process.
His worst fears were now confirmed. Even though the planes were flying low, the arming mechanism had done its job.
What we had here, basically, was a bomb that was waiting to go bang. It just needed the slightest touch, almost. Not a sway or a push, but something like that. And that would have gone bang. And I had to take this out of the ship. The way I can best describe it is when you take your very young sleeping child from the back of a car at the end of a long day up to bed, you do it in a way that it doesn't know it's being moved. And that was in my mind about moving this bomb. I have to move it without it knowing that it's being moved.
Bernie successfully removed the bomb from the Galahad. Naval disposal teams cradled unexploded bombs off 6 other ships. If these bombs had detonated on impact, the British campaign would have been stopped in its tracks. Exocet missiles hit a vital British supply ship, the Atlantic Conveyor. It was carrying 4 giant Chinook helicopters. 3 were destroyed. It was perhaps the single greatest setback of the war.
I had been preparing a plan to move my brigade forward onto the high ground overlooking Stanley, and the key part of that plan was 4 Chinook helicopters.
In the rush to pack equipment onto the task force ships, crucial errors had been made.
I think it was a great mistake to put all your eggs in one basket, particularly such expensive, important eggs as that. Certainly in my own mind, in my own journal that I kept at the time, you know, I made 1 or 2 really pithy comments about what the hell are they doing? Are they completely mad?
The destruction of that one ship changed the tempo of the whole war as far as we're concerned. We would have to walk.
The plan was for 3 Commando Brigade to approach Port Stanley from the northeast, rather than the route the Argentinians were expecting from the south. But the heavily burdened troops now faced a 60-mile march through the ferocious winds of the Falklands winter.
We hadn't carried such large weights before. 120 pounds a man, perhaps 150 in some cases. So some men were carrying 2/3 of their own body weight, perhaps a little more. The loads were so heavy to begin with that it wasn't actually easy to get them on our backs.
Must be about 30 years, I think, since certainly I've seen this.
Yeah, I haven't seen this.
Amazing.
This kit laid out like this for over 30 years, and this is almost identical to what the individual was carrying in the Falklands. I was a GPMG gunner, and I carried this, which is 24 pounds, and as a team we were given 6,000 rounds of 7.62 Link. Now 200 rounds weighs 12 pounds. If you can imagine 6,000 of these when 200 weighs 12 pounds, and if somebody has got a calculator they can work that out, but I know it's quite heavy.
It was quite difficult with all the additional weight to actually yomp and be in an alert position. And I used to fall over all the time, and initially you'd have to take your Bergen off, take your 84mm anti-tank weapon off, put it all back on, get yourself sorted, and it took too long. So in the end, I used to just get 3 guys to right me, put me on my feet, and then you'd carry on.
Trench foot was the first stage of frostbite, and that would very quickly deplete our fighting strength. I thought the exposure problem was really serious, so there was no way of getting them out of it. And cold injuries were the thing that really worried me.
The shortage of helicopter transport meant that the troops' rations didn't always reach them.
Young men who'd never really been hungry beyond a healthy appetite, burning perhaps 5,000 calories in a day, no food.
The hunger consumed us. We would talk endlessly about what we wanted to eat.
I felt giddy, I felt jumpy, I felt irritable. It was similar to not having slept. You started not making rational decisions, started thinking irrationally.
As the march towards Stanley continued, High Command in London set a new challenge. The politicians needed some good news from the front, so precious resources would have to be diverted to capture the hamlet of Goose Green in the south. Even though the 2nd Parachute Battalion were outnumbered by the Argentinian defenders, they won a remarkable victory. But 36 men were wounded, and 16 were killed.
Captain James, Lieutenant Parry, Corporal Hartman.
On June the 1st, the task force was reinforced by 5 Infantry Brigade. 2 of its battalions had joined the brigade just a few weeks earlier.
We were on public duties. I was on a trooping the colour in 81. Actually, my first duty after leaving Sandhurst was the royal wedding of the spring of 81. But in the months immediately prior to the Falklands, we were on public duties, mainly Windsor Castle Guards.
The troops of 5 Brigade arrived in the Falklands with no real experience of Arctic or amphibious warfare.
We were put on landing craft and taken to a jetty in San Carlos Bay, which is still there. Walking out the beach, I bumped into a Marine colour sergeant who said to me, I remember being rather shocked at the time, what the are you people doing here? I thought he was going to say hello or shake my hand, that actually, at least in his eyes, we weren't wanted. Looking back on it 30 years later, that was one of the frictions that made our job much, much more difficult.
5 Brigade's task was made even harder because they'd been sent to the Falklands without some of the crucial equipment and supplies essential for fighting in this harsh environment.
From where we sat, it looked a strange decision to send 2 battalions which had no experience in that sort of environment into that sort of operation. And the brigade of which they were part had very little logistics. That, to begin with, they had no artillery, they had no helicopter squadron, they had no engineers. It was all put together in a rather ad hoc way at the last minute.
Now, Ivar Hellberg learned that he would have to handle the complex logistics for the new brigade. Nor was it clear what 5 Brigade's mission would be.
What was wrong with their deployment, in my view, was that there was a certain woolliness about what they were meant to be doing. There was talk of them being occupation troops, and I don't believe that they were given a firm mission.
But the commander of 5 Brigade, Brigadier Tony Wilson, wanted a much more active role for his troops. The new Land Forces commander, General Jeremy Moore, agreed that 5 Brigade should open a second front, approaching Stanley from the south. But the new southern route was exactly what the Argentinians were expecting. Even worse, overstretched resources would have to be diverted from the Marines and Paras, yomping across the northeastern route.
The approach from the south was militarily insane. It was wrong by any measure. There was an established logistic route on the north side of the island. Their logistics were hair thin.
Their first march did not bode well.
Just before we were about to leave, the mortar platoon arrived with pallets of mortar ammunition, which were broken up and put into our backpacks. Now, my Bergen was already heavy enough for me. To put 2 mortar bombs into it, on top of link ammunition, grenades, all the rest of it, made it practically uncarryable.
The march was called off after less than 2 miles. Some saw this failure as a sign that the Welsh Guards were not fit for operations in the Falklands.
I think it's a terribly cheeky thing to say, and very inaccurate. And I think it, in some cases, is as a result of this kind of over-eliteness that we saw in some people down there. No one's pretending we were as fit as the Marines. How could we have been? And anybody expecting that sort of thing must have been either very stupid or mad.
But the failure of the march required a new plan. The Welsh Guards would have to be carried by sea. It was the first step on the road to tragedy. On June the 8th, 2 companies of the Guards were on board a landing ship, the Galahad, heading for Bluff Cove. The plan was for them to land at night to avoid the risk of air attack, but they had been delayed, so they arrived in Fitzroy at daybreak.
Actually, I was trying to get Galahad to move because it was a sitting duck. It was at anchor, for goodness sake. You know, beautiful skies, clear as they came. Absolute sitting duck. We'd seen how effective the Argentinian Air Force had been. I went and saw Galahad and went on board and tried to persuade the infantry of the Welsh Guards to get off the ship right away.
The Galahad was lightly armed, and the Welsh Guards had no defense against air attack.
They actually hadn't seen the Argentine Air Force at work, because for the 5 days they'd been there, the bad weather had kept the Argentine Air Force away. So they hadn't seen how deadly those guys could be. And I can tell you, if I'd been on board that ship, I'd have swum ashore rather than stayed there.
Lieutenant Black was on the Galahad, preparing his platoon to disembark.
My guardsman operator, so the radio operator, puts his hand on my shoulder and says, Sir, it's air raid warning red. And I think I must have been on my way turning around to him and saying, it can't be air raid warning red. We were only at air raid warning whatever it was. And I thought he must have made a mistake when we heard this tremendous roar. People shout, get down, get down. I'm still standing up. I'm standing opposite my sort of best mate. The force of the blast is so strong that it blows him against the bulkhead and dislocates his shoulder. I think there was pandemonium, nuclear screaming, and you could, behind me there were men stumbling out of the doorway. Some of the casualties coming up were clearly in extreme pain.